Welcome. Excited to talk with y'all about de-risking today. Um, so an integral de-risking is a central tool. It is a central tool that we use to build great software. That allows us to step-by-step remove the biggest things standing between where we are now and what we know our software can deliver in terms of value. So you might ask yourself, why talk about de-risking? What's the value to me? I found that the de-risking tools that I'm going to share today are helpful if one, you're taking on significant responsibilities and aiming for big wins, but also carrying significant stress about the things that might go wrong on your watch. And you don't want to end up holding the bag at the end, but you also really want to take on those responsibilities. Two, maybe you know there's a way you could lead your team better, but daily fire drills keep you too frazzled to find that path a lot of the time. Three, maybe you found yourself solving a really big bad problem that just popped up with a lot of urgency, and then you realize later that you spent hours on work that didn't end up very valuable. Or maybe it's the other way around, that you did very little about a risk or a problem, maybe like a few months ago. You were hoping for the best, and then realized later on, today, tomorrow, whenever, that if you'd turned over a few rocks, done a little more research back then, you could have found out some info or solved the problem earlier on and saved yourself a lot of pain today. Or four, maybe you've attempted to rally the people that you need to solve a problem, and instead found ambivalence, or worse yet, you're wading through red tape and miscommunications and lack of alignment on what needs to happen next, or if the risk even matters. For us, de-risking helps us solve all of these problems. Sounds great, doesn't it? So let's dive in. We'll talk more about what de-risking means. I want to start by talking about some core definitions, and then we'll get into how we apply these in practice. So I'll start with this question. We use the word risk a lot. It's a buzzword and a bit jargony even at this point. So I'm curious our thoughts on what it means. If you want to take a minute here, I'll give you a minute to drop into the chat in the webinar. I'm sure using the chat and not the Q&A function for this. On either your definition of risk or specific examples of big risks that you worry about often. Give folks a minute here to drop those into the chat. See what can go wrong. Thank you, Julian. Any other definitions of risk or specific risks? Ooh, I like uncertainty there. We'll talk quite a bit about uncertainty and outcomes today. Thank you, Steph. I like the word hampered too. I don't think that's anywhere in my slides or script today, but Raj, I'm going to borrow that now. Thank you. And financial and time impact, good note. Scope creep, ooh, yeah, that's a terrifying one all the time. Adverse effects. Ooh, assumptions about solutions. And I see scope there again coming up, and sizing kind of comes back to time, I think, there for those often. So, I'll give people a few more minutes now. Folks are dropping. Lunch needed a second to digest and get the brain flowing. Ooh, I like the prevent or alter language. That's helpful. Like we're on a path and we're going to get knocked off to somewhere else. And I like the probability, Wes. We'll use some similar language as well here as we walk through. Any others folks want to throw in? All right, jump in. Similar to some of what we saw there, I like this definition of risk here. If you want a shorter version of what you see on screen as far as the risk is a possibility of something bad happening, that could complete the sentence, our plan failed because. I also like thinking of it as a bad thing that could leave us effed over. This is the stuff similar to what folks shared in the chat that might cause us to end up in troubled waters instead of getting to where we want to go and delivering valuable software. In software development, often we see big risks related to things like technical assumptions or dependencies, particularly the, excuse me, the first time we're building a new architecture, a language or a framework. within an architectural language or a framework, or if we're integrating outside our product. Those are often big technical assumptions and dependencies that create a lot of risk for us. Bad things happen there often. And interfacing with the customer from a technical perspective can also create unexpected problems, or even problems we expect, but we need to find out whether they're real or not. There's also the common market risks of, will our customers love it? Will they use it? Will they pay for it? And there's also operational risks. I heard some of those mentioned as well. Can we actually build the thing and operate it and maintain it? And can the business sustain the investment? Will we have the time and the dollars to get this software up and running and keep it up and running in order to make it profitable? So each of these pops up every day for me, at least, as we're working through building our products here at Integral. Every story, every feature, mini versions and really big versions of these kinds of risks pop up. Software engineers, designers, managers, you see so many potential little bad things that could happen. And some of those add up very quickly to very big bad things. And raising risks then becomes complex and messy, right? We've all seen this. So when wading through those details, it's easy to get overwhelmed or even lose track of what problem you were trying to solve when you started seeking to prevent a bad thing from happening or reach your goal. For me, this definition of risk is then helpful because by focusing on the bad things that might happen and how that's related directly to what we're trying to accomplish in delivering valuable software, I've got clear anchor points in talking about risk with all of the folks involved. I'll often ask the engineers those questions. Cool, what's the bad thing that could happen here? How is this getting in the way of finishing the story, completing the feature? Why can't we start the feature because of the bad thing? Getting really clear on the relationship between the potential, the non-zero probability of a bad thing, and what we're trying to accomplish and what our plan looks like here. So with that clarity, it also becomes obvious to me that not all risks are created equal. So I found that if we're building valuable software, we're going to take on a lot of risks, actually. There's going to be a sea of risks floating around us as we're building this software, and we need to be able to prioritize across them. I might even go as far as to say that I consistently see a strong direct relationship between holding and managing those biggest risks and getting them, as we would call it, de-risked, and successfully delivering our biggest value, right? You take on risks in order to deliver value. And that's where the tools we use that we call de-risking come in. They allow us to focus on addressing the assumptions we're making, and in order to find out how bad the really bad things are or aren't, and end up with software that meets the need and delivers value. So let's talk a little bit more about the definition of de-risking. This is at least the bumper sticker version. You may have heard the Mark Twain quote, "Do the hardest thing first." I stole from that and created this one that sticks in my head at least and helps me think about de-risking. Of course, you can't really do the riskiest thing because it's a bad thing that might happen and leave us left over. So I can't do that, but what I can do is find the most optimal way to turn that potential bad thing into something in reality and that I know the truth about now. It's no longer an assumption. It's no longer a non-zero probability. I've taken, by doing the riskiest thing first, I've taken the assumptions and brought them into truth and reality, tested and either verified them right or wrong, ideally by building software that proves that out. And that's the approach we take to de-risking prioritization. Of course, that leads to this question then. Cool, I'm in for debunking my assumptions or finding out they're true and doing the addressing the riskiest things first. So how do I find out what the riskiest thing is? There's a lot of things that we could end up effed up on, and I've got to decide what to take on. So let's dive into that next. We've got a few tools that we use to help identify potential bad things and get us to the point where we're confidently navigating past those bad things and delivering valuable software. Before we do that, I'll pause. You'll also notice there is a Q&A function. Yes, I saw Doug. If you have to eat a frog today, do it first thing in the morning. Thank you for. And if you have to eat two, I suggest you eat the larger one first, I believe is the add-on from Mark Twain on that as well. Oh, sorry, Doug, I stole your thunder by like 30 seconds, 2 seconds even. If you have questions, please throw them in the Q&A. I'll pause here as I'm rambling with Doug about my favorite Mark Twain quotes. Feel free to use the Q&A function. That will allow Lindsay, who's helping facilitate here, to help make sure those questions get answered. I'm gonna keep us moving as we go along, but I will pause all along the way for questions. If there's questions on any of the definitions and kind of our grounding points there, before we jump forward, feel free to drop them into that Q&A. All right, so tools that allow us to prioritize our risk and turn the bad things that could happen into value delivery in software. So like any good consultant, I like to start with a basic quadrant diagram as a solid beginning. For this one on the x-axis, to the right side here, we have all of the potential bad things that, if they came true, were completely fucked, disastrous, Titanic level shipwreck. To the left, those are the things that, sure, they matter a bit, but at the end of the day, no one's ultimately going to give a shit if they happen, or they'll give very small ones, right? It's not that big of a deal. So I like to think about how bad is the bad thing between disaster to no one noticed there. On the y-axis, up at the top, we have things with really high levels of uncertainty and complexity. I saw that mentioned in our definitions earlier, right? Uncertainty adds risk. And so at the top, those are the things that you don't yet, at least, have any clue what to do about it. At the bottom, these are things that are completely Googleable. You will find lots of answers on how to best address this. It's common knowledge on how to solve the problem and prevent the bad thing from happening. Gotta do a click there. There we go. So give me a chance here. I'd love to see in the chat, where do you think the riskiest things live? Quadrant 1, 2, 3, or 4? Just drop a number in the chat. Roz, I saw your question. By de-risking, do we mean how we handle risks? I'll pause and answer that while folks are voting in the chat for which quadrant they think holds the riskiest thing. Yes, in short, this is our approach. We call it de-risking to handling risks. And the idea is that you may have heard people use the word mitigation, and I'll even use it likely a few times here. But from our ideal, we want to look for not just mitigating the risk, but actually going, how do we remove that risk? There's some assumption or uncertainty that leads us to recognize that between us and profitable working software, something really bad could, or not so bad, could happen. And so we want to take approaches that remove the risk, that make us confident now that that potentially bad thing is no longer a potential bad thing. All right, let me jump over to see votes here. Drop those votes in. I've got a mixture of 1s and 2s, and it looks like 1s are actually leading. Any other votes before I drop to give you the answer? Get them in now or forever hold your peace. So I will jump over here. For us, the riskiest thing is in the upper right quadrant here. And maybe, I don't know if it was the diagram or not, but the things in the left quadrant, these are things with really high levels of uncertainty. We'll come back to this later. These are really important as well. So we may talk about why some folks voted 1. If you want to share in the chat as we keep moving forward why you voted 1 for the folks that did, I would be curious what drew you to that. It may have been misreading the diagram, or maybe there's something you're thinking about this that makes these the important things to address. We'll actually talk a little bit about quadrant run. So quadrant 2 is where we start. And quadrant 1 is really often where I'm going second. For quadrant 2, we already have a really clear idea that if this bad thing happens, it's really, really going to mess up getting to our results. And so we start there to both pull out uncertainty from the project and make it into reality, address those assumptions, and also to address the biggest things that we're already confident will cause us problems if they turn out to be real bad things and not just potential bad things. I'll pause here and say that while that in some ways may sound a little bit obvious that you start at the top and start at the things that you already think are the worst possible things and have the most uncertainty in them, in my experience, I do want to note that the moment that you take this potential shit show and make it the top item in your backlog, people, they struggle, sometimes even lose their minds a little bit. It's hard to take on debunking your riskiest assumptions, addressing your risky assumptions, building software against them first. So be ready to take care of your team when you take on your riskiest things first and work against those assumptions to build software and find out what the bad things are or aren't. I'll give a couple of examples here. A year and a half ago, we were working to help a major OEM sell their first car online. We were the critical last step where a customer filled out their finance application, $60,000+ car. And so they were going to often be financing it. And they were able to even, in some cases, get an immediate decision back on that credit approval. And so pretty key step where we had to do a lot of things. And there were some really big ticket items that sat in this upper right quadrant for us, where there was a lot of uncertainty in how we were going to build it. And a lot was going to go wrong if we couldn't make it work in order to help sell these vehicles online. The questions were things like, well, how would we know that we were passing all of the required data to get that automatic decision, or even to get a decision at all? Or what if some of the values that the customer entered were wrong, because customers make typos or just enter things that don't make sense? And also, how would we address specifically address and having an address validator to prevent credit rejections because of some invalid address due to a typo? Another one that came up was how we would keep the finance application status synced between the lender and the OEM databases. They each held data about this transaction. And particularly that was important in those few moments from between when the customer clicked submit on the application and then when they got that automatic decision back on screen. We had to synchronize the status changes that were happening in all the computers and all the databases. So as we took these on, we worked to prioritize them based on how far they were into this upper right corner. The team got tired and often frustrated, which is understandable. We were taking on things that had a lot of unknown and were stressful because we knew that we had to get them done in order to have any chance of succeeding in building this finance application. So we needed to maintain a lot of clarity on why we were taking this approach and understanding the risk that we were removing and the challenges we were taking on, the assumptions we were addressing. We also had to offer each other human care, taking breaks, cracking jokes, have fun and laughter, and even sometimes allowing ourselves to take on some easier or more interesting stories that might be in the other quadrants to give us a chance to do something that wasn't the slog of working through our riskiest things. Also note, you often need to be ready for care for not just your team, but also all of the executives and leaders that care about the work you're doing, because this can be stressful for them as you slog through. Give an example from just a few weeks ago, had to allay some fears from our leadership team on a project because we'd taken on as a new engagement, and we'd taken on a pretty big chunk of our first user flow in one story. We chose to do that because it helped us address some significant technical risks, some uncertainties, unknowns, and assumptions about what we would be building and how we would be building it. And it also allowed us to address risks about what we would be able to build in this environment and getting a full, simple end-to-end flow completed in a very basic vanilla functioning clickable button software way. So we chose to do that in order to address both technical and UX and risks. And also it gave us a moment to really show the client something that functioned. It also helped us with a morale risk, gave us a big wow moment for ourselves and for the client, because our first demo ended up being almost full click-through of a very basic user flow, which is great to see working software in our first demo. At the same time, from leadership's point of view, as they're waiting day after day to see what we're able to get done as we get started, we'd gotten stuck on one story right out the gates. It took us over a week to complete. So in the end, there was a lesson for us learned, of course, on breaking up work more into smaller and smaller pieces. We probably could have addressed that big risk by splitting out that story into several smaller ones. At the same time, I don't know that I overly regret spending less time massaging the backlog so that we could jump right into meaty, valuable, risk-removing work. And in the end, that core software, once it was demoed, really was impressive to the client and helped us build a lot of trust. And also, we're now flowing through other work much more quickly because of the amount of assumptions we've gotten out of the way and no longer carrying that risk as we work through additional stories. So it's really proven the value of that approach. Pause. Any other questions as well? Feel free. Now's a good time to drop those as we take a look at this quadrant. I'm also just giving myself a second to read the chat. as I mentioned, I will come back to talking a little bit in quadrant one, actually, as in what we're going to start to go through next. So at this point, I have to tell you that our CEO, originally I had a very different setup for this, and our CEO convinced me of a quadrant diagram, which now that I did it, I have to admit he was right. Really helpful tool to look at this in a quadrant, as it often is. However, I originally built out a completely different and hip visual way of digging into this, and now is the time where we get to bust that out. That's right. You can use what you've learned so far in the quadrant diagram and what we're going to talk about the rest of the session in an equation that is entirely built of memes and even an emoji. If anyone wants to help me file the actual trademark paperwork for the MacTac risk score, please feel free to slide into my DMs. I would gladly take help with getting a real trademark on this. So to actually jump into the equation, at the core on the left here, the first part of it is the delta between the biggest win that we could achieve in this potential outcome. That's what we're aiming for in a lot of ways, right? Here's the thing that would be the best thing that could happen. And then the delta is really then thinking about, well, what's the worst FML that could also come out of this? And then notice that the unknown in complexity is actually an exponent on that level of bad, good to bad, at delta. As was mentioned by, I believe it was Davin or Bailey maybe at the beginning, that mentioned uncertainty. And Davin, in your choosing of Nevin 1, I think I saw you expressing that reason there. The level of unknown means that while we think that delta is big or small, it actually could be completely different. So I like to think of that uncertainty and complexity and unknown as an exponent on the difference between good and bad outcomes, because it means I really don't know if it's that good or that bad yet. And then finally, I do want to note it's really important in this equation to also think about subtracting the cost of the de-risking work. No matter how much the delta is or how uncertain it is, how much does it cost to find out if that risk is really a bad thing or not is a really important question. I like this equation, not just because it's kind of fun and I like to play with silly things like this, but also because it leads me to three questions that I find yield huge impact for finding out what's really in that top right quadrant and understanding how to best address it. You can spend a lot of time doing a lot of things to analyze risks, identify mitigations, chase them down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Preventing bad things from happening can take up a lot of your time. Huge amounts of management and communicative overhead can be spent. And so strong de-risking ROI is one of the areas that we often find we get the best impact on our projects. So these two questions are what helps me do that. When a bad thing that could happen comes up on our engagements, I like to ask these three because of the power that they have. I want to walk through them one at a time, and then we'll come back to this slide and you'll see all three on screen again, so I don't worry too much here. Walk through them one at a time and talk about why they're each powerful. You'll also note they correspond to each of the parts of the equation. We're going to start with that exponent at the top. It's first exactly because of some of what's already been named here in the chat and the things I've been sharing. Whoever said what you don't know can't hurt you has clearly never worked in software development. Any amount of time you spent building something, you know that the unknowns and the complexities can change everything about how bad the bad things are, or maybe how not bad at all they are, unexpectedly perhaps, and how hard the mitigations and building the software actually is. So with high levels of uncertainty, we have no confidence of being able to mitigate the risk or even knowing the size of the bad thing that could happen. So I like to start by establishing how well we understand the bad thing itself that could happen. If there's a lot of murkiness here, we can do a lot then to address that uncertainty and reduce the amount of risk. I think of the address of validation example that I mentioned about the finance application as a great example here of a situation where I wish I had more rigorously applied this question. We had been given a UX spec that showed how this address validator would work. The client then had a homebrewed tool that was ready to go. We could integrate with. Expected it all to be super easy peasy, low value work. And so we trusted that and put it later on in our backlog. The thing is, we didn't know if any of those assumptions were actually true. No one else had tested to verify them yet. No one else had built the thing we were supposed to build there. So the level of unknown was actually really high. In reality, it turned out that the homebrewed tool that the client had was intended to function in a completely different way than what was in our UX spec as how the address validator was going to work. And the API was confusing to work with because of some poor documentation, and some of the actual structure of the data we got back was confusing. Once we understood it, it worked great, but there was a lot of work to do to understand how to send it, the addresses we were getting, and how to interpret what we were getting back from the API. Then after we'd implemented our initial integration with that address validator while we were working with our business side, we learned additional business details about why the address validation was needed by the lenders. And it turned out our implementation of the address validation initially wouldn't actually save the customer from the potential problems they might have with the lender if their address couldn't be verified in the system. So then we had to go back and make even more changes to using the tool that we were using in our integration with it in order to really satisfy that lender's business requirement and be confident that customers were going to be able to get a correct address that they would then send to the lender and avoid typos and avoid address formatting issues. So what I'd originally told my engineers would be two super quick and easy stories turned into a seemingly never-ending journey. And it took months to unravel all of the problems in this. And it blocked up our backlog several times and caused a lot of confusion. In hindsight, I wish we, or perhaps even the design team that had built that original UX very early on, could have done this. We could have just dug into it, documented the root business needs more clearly, and then actually run a spike and created a proof of concept, very basic integration to show how the homebrewed tool worked. And what that would then lead to as far as being able to build the UX we needed to build. Of course, sometimes the opposite is also true when you do run that spike. I've had multiple times where we see an integration like this where, oh gosh, we've never built one of those before. No one else around here has. And so there's a lot of big assumptions and risks. You run that proof of concept spike and make sure you really clearly understand the business requirements related to it, and actually are able to confirm that there's not big problems at all. So really helpful to start by really getting a sense of how you can go from a lot of uncertainty and complexity to very clear understanding of what it is you need to build, and having actually written some code to prove that it'll work the way you think it's going to work and have that confidence. Moving on to the second question, this gets to the core of that equation. I think this is really important because this delta it gives us the sense of what the core value is that de-risking this risk could yield. The assumptions that we've made could lead to a really big range of outcomes, really amazing, all the way to really awful. And so we want to make sure to think about both possible outcomes to get the value of de-risking and finding out the truth behind those assumptions. The bigger that gap is, that's actually the value. And that's important because there's two big traps you can fall into here that this question helps me avoid. A lot of people only consider one side of the equation, and they end up chasing either a risk that seems really bad, but the best outcome isn't that much better anyways. Or perhaps it seems like you're getting a really big risk mitigating win, and so you do the thing, but nothing that bad was really going to happen if you didn't prioritize that thing anyways. The second example, I often see pixel perfect front ends and micromanaging SAD paths and error messages getting put in place and all the fields being perfect, and wordsmithing copy are examples where it looks really great, right? But is it really removing significant assumptions or risk? I'll give an example there from the finance application I mentioned, where we had a whole lot of styling that we still needed to clean up. There were some fields we just hadn't even bothered to add address validations to yet. And we were getting asked when we were going to address those, why we were prioritizing. There were also some defects that had been found in what we'd already been built. And there were other teams that had actually already gotten all their fields, all their field validation. The page looked great, exactly like it should. Ours did not yet. And so it raised a lot of questions because our page looked less functional than these other pages. We ended up finding out later that those other pages had prioritized making their page look really pretty and having everything work the way it was supposed to. But they had not gotten all of those fields working correctly. They were not integrated with some of the third-party tooling that they needed to use or the databases where that data was going. And so the page wasn't doing all the things that it appeared to be doing. And so all of those things on the page are common knowledge work that's going to get done one way or another. They sit actually in that bottom right quadrant of things that definitely matter. Your page needs to look really beautiful at some point before you go to production, ideally, but also that you just take time to get done. So you can do those things early and you score a really big win because your page just looks so great, but you haven't actually done much to prevent all the really bad things that will keep you from your goals, which usually are the more functional things underlying all of the pretty page. We were really glad we didn't fall for that trap. We'd prioritized all of our core business functionality, uncovered a bunch of problems that we needed time to work through with integrators, and started working through with them and pushing things back and forth to each other as we came to understand how to solve those problems together to get to a successful credit application. And while we worked through those problems, we were able to keep doing all the things to eventually make our page look and act really snazzy, exactly like it was supposed to. For the second trap, the example I think of there is actually avoidance of early and often demoing to key stakeholders, or even putting your software directly in front of customers. Often the reason I see for that is that the worst outcome seems really scary. If you put less than perfect software in front of people, you might get really harsh feedback. They might even outright reject it and tell you it doesn't do what it needs to do at all and not even want to look at it. The example above, there were times where not so pretty page, we're like, wait, is this even ready to test yet? But we had very clear things we needed them to test, right? At the same time, the thing is that feedback is inevitable. Your software is never going to be perfect. And even if it is perfect, you're still going to get feedback. And actually, the best outcomes depend on great feedback. So people are often avoiding this potential bad outcome that they see of, gosh, my software could have a ton of problems and I don't want to demo it or get it out there until I'm really confident it doesn't have those problems. But actually, the best outcome on the other side of that is getting that feedback and addressing those problems. I think of the Pareto principle here, where we take the approach often of doing 20% of the work to get 80% functional software. And then that beta version and the feedback we get on it allows us to then develop more and more into exactly what we know our customers are going to love, use, and pay for. So that feedback is actually really important, even though it can feel like the bad outcome that you're trying to avoid. Try to find the click again. Third question. So at Integral, we often talk about making lean hypotheses, taking a scientific approach to how you can address the assumptions behind a risk, and doing so in the smallest way that you can. And that's what this question helps us do. It's really tempting and so common to design elaborate mitigation plans, really be confident you've addressed all of the possible assumptions and aspects of a bad thing. It often is a way to give the appearance that you're on top of preventing that bad thing from happening. But it's almost always false comfort. The reality is, as you start to address assumptions, you're going to learn more. Each step forward in building software against those assumptions gives you more information about the risk of the bad thing happening, and what you can or can't do about it. So for me, instead of taking a big solves it all mitigation approach, I want to identify the thinnest slice of working software that our team can build that will prove or disprove the assumptions that we're making about the bad thing that could happen. So I think of in the credit decision example that I'd mentioned, originally the client wanted to build the entire page first before we'd integrated with the lender and before we tested any immediate decisioning on the page. That included an individual application, a joint application, additional legal forms, and a bunch of other characteristics about the client, about the applicant, et cetera, that we needed to get to the lender. But from our perspective, the biggest bad thing that could happen, the biggest risk we needed to address, was our ability to integrate anything with this lender and get any decision, or at least ideally better yet, to show that we could get a successful, a pending, and a rejected decision in the ways that the lender was expecting. And so what we advised was to complete just the simplest, the smallest version of a basic individual application to get an immediate decision. And we were really glad the client went with us on that we took that pathway. While a few of us on the team worked to address the problems that we had found in that initial integration with the lender on a basic application and worked through some really sticky integration problems, we were able to then add on all of the other features as far as the joint application, legal forms, and additional fields and details, et cetera. And in the end, that all came together for a successful prod launch. And that prod launch likely would have been delayed if we'd ended up finding those problems later because we hadn't taken a first thin slice at our biggest problem that we might have. And also the smallest action might be even smaller. Recently, we discovered on a project that I'm currently working on that a third-party service provider we're using doesn't support using shadow DOM. That helps control for page styling. So we're going to have folks loading our components onto their page, and those consumers might end up overriding some of our styling is the risk that we were facing, the bad thing that could happen if those styles on their page ended up overriding the styling on the components that we were loading. Just end up looking funky or perhaps even being not particularly functional if the styles made it really hard for the user to navigate the component that we loaded. So we played a single research story, a spike, and we built a proof of concept playing with the shadow DOM possibilities for overriding styling. And that took just less than a day. And it gave us confidence in the results of that story and the working code we'd played with on the page that we wouldn't have styling issues unless a consumer was making very unlikely and not best practice, not leading practice mistakes in how they handled their own styling on their page. So for us, that was problem solved enough. And we also then, if a consumer made those styling mistakes with our components, we had documentation to share on how to fix it. Yes, Raj, thank you for mentioning definition of ready and definition of done. Those are also incredibly helpful. I'm going to help me remember to come back to those if I don't, Raj, after we finish the third question. And let's specifically talk about the relationship of definition of ready and definition of done to how we approach de-risking. Excellent point. So I'll finish with one last bonus question here. You've used these three handy dandy questions. You've arrived at your McTech risk score that I haven't actually trademarked yet, but maybe someday. There's one more question that I find is really helpful to ask. You need to make sure that this de-risking activity sits somewhere in line with the rest of your priorities. You've got an entire backlog of work that you're doing. Ideally, we seek to write cards in our backlog for the small actions. You've heard me mention spikes a few times. Or sometimes we even just include them as an acceptance criteria or a technical guidance or note in our existing stories. As much as possible, one of the things that's really important for us is taking those assumptions that ultimately are the roots of the bad things that could happen and either getting them in their own cards that we're going to use to address that or getting them somewhere into our existing backlog. This forces us to recognize the cost of the de-risking actions we're taking in our backlog. It's accounted for. Often other times I've seen risk mitigation is like a separate work stream that ends up kind of being a distraction, and then you're trying to prioritize two things at once, and it's incredibly difficult to do. Or perhaps you've been on a team where a leader runs fire drills on urgent risks immediately as they arise because they want to address them with and show that they've removed that bad thing from happening and address the problem, but they don't recognize how that interrupts current work and causes confusion for the team and slows the team down. So integrating your de-risking activities into your backlog directly helps you instead keep the addressing of the risks and the de-risking activities coordinated as part of the software that you're delivering story in and story out. It also allows you to prioritize de-risking with clarity around its value relative to the software you're delivering. So sometimes you just have to focus on getting a key feature completed or being ready to being prepared for a major prod launch. And even something that is clearly high value de-risking activity needs to wait until you get past a certain milestone in the software you're building. Other times, de-risking is a perfect investment to make early on because it'll smooth out the stories in your backlog and get you to that prod launch faster, stronger, better, harder. And sometimes the de-risking tools even make clear that that fire drill is really necessary. In any of those cases, the tools that we're using here help us communicate to everyone about the risk itself, the bad thing that could happen, and the de-risking approach that we're taking to address the assumptions underneath it and find out the reality in working software. This helps you get everyone on board with the approach you're taking in a coordinated fashion. And I think, Raj, to what you shared, sorry, that's a failure on my part, Step. The SOARS is shiny object risk syndrome. Often that is the leader that runs fire drills on every major risk that comes up. Is my made-up name for that disease that you have happen where a risk comes up, it's a shiny object and you chase it instead of doing it in a coordinated fashion. So Raj, to your point about definition of ready and definition of done, 100% agreed. This is where I typically apply that. I want to make sure that my definition of ready, the gate of this story and the acceptance criteria in it are clear and ready to play. And then also at the feature level, or if you have a epic or sub-epic level above your features that organize them, that those also have really clear definitions of ready for your user stories, your acceptance criteria, your documentation, et cetera. Often I've even seen people successfully, and I've taken this approach as well, include de-risking criteria as part of their definition of ready and definition of done. That you have raised the potential questions, like the three that I've given here, for this specific feature or story, and that you've then documented it in the ACs, and the same thing on the definition of done. Then once you finish the story, that you have checkmarked the assumptions. And often for us, that even includes written the next stories. So if you've got a spike or specific risks and assumptions you're trying to address, one of our acceptance criteria is we know that you're gonna address some assumptions, and based on what you learn, one of your ACs is to write the next story that needs to get played relative to the assumptions we're making and the bad thing we're seeking to prevent from happening, the goal we're trying to reach here. So thanks, Raj. Appreciate the point about definition of ready and definition of done in our backlog there. Yes, thank you, John. Also love this comment here. You're right. It's going to be really hard on the managerial side too. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my engineers are so frustrated. And this is not a fun thing to go through. And why can't we just immediately take care of tech debt or play a spike on this? And you're right, it is balancing the potential bad things that can happen. One of the things that I've found helpful at some point to point out is that the biggest risk is that no one wants to pay you for the software you're building anymore, whether that's your customers that are paying revenue to use the software, a client that you're building software for. So sometimes we have to address that bad thing that could happen rather than the software itself, and navigate all of the technical, the business, and the operational risks. Same thing as I mentioned earlier, one of the risks that you see is you're starting to take on really difficult assumptions and de-risk them. It's hard. So sometimes you have to address an operational risk that your people are tired and don't want to keep doing this, or even if they are willing to keep grinding at it, they're no longer really able to be effective and they need a break. And so, yeah, it's really important to balance not just the technical risks, which I know engineers are often so heavily focused on, and really important that they raise them as we keep moving through. And then also balance those against all of the other bad things that could happen besides the technical pieces. I would also say that's where the backlog coordination is incredibly helpful for me, because it allows me to empower the engineers on my team. If you're on a team as an engineer where you aren't able to do this, feel free to advocate for saying, hey, can I just throw a spike in the backlog? And if not, why not? And then your product owner, your product manager can take that spike or that tech debt story that you've put in the backlog and seek clarity on the business value that it would deliver, the risk that you see there, but that story is just in the backlog now, and it is a risk or an assumption, a need that is named that you can prioritize against and work through. All right, that is what I have to share today. Now that you've drunk from the fire hydrant of de-risking ideas, I'm curious, what other questions or comments or ideas do we have that we want to talk about in the last 10 minutes?